We mentioned that nonprofit organizations are wildly unregulated in the United States. What federal body is most involved in providing us with guidance on how we operate? Internal Revenue Service, right? The IRS has a lot to say about how it is that nonprofits operate. Why is that? Because we provide opportunities for people to reduce their tax liability, right? Contributions to nonprofit organizations are tax deductible. So I would argue that the IRS has stepped up to provide some regulation where others didn't because they have a vested interest. So we got to make sure we understand how the IRS works and how we fit in as a nonprofit organization. One of the things I'll give you just as a quick example that people need to understand is that when you sell a ticket to somebody for an event, the full amount of the ticket price is not tax deductible, right? Only the amount that's over and beyond the value of what you're getting in return. So if it's a $50 ticket to an event and the plate was $25, then $25 of it is deductible. That's a very small example, but those are the types of things as individuals who serve on nonprofit boards that you have to develop some understanding of. And good nonprofit organizations are going to provide you with orientation to make sure that you understand that. Number 6, ensure effective organizational planning. So that means that institutions are required to have a plan that says this is how we're going to operate, this is how we're going to grow, this is what the next year of operation for the institution looks like. And then we've got to figure out a way to monitor that. So board members have to materially participate in the establishment of a plan, and then you've got to be actively involved in making sure that we're complying with what that plan says. Board myth number 1, upon their election, board members will transform into effective directors without orientation or training. The pity laughter, I gotta say, I just really appreciate it. And this is my favorite one because I don't really know what we're looking at in the picture because it's like this dude, I mean, it's clearly a guy progressing across the screen. This dude is a doctor, I think, and then he's a lawyer. So I'm not really sure what that has to do with sportsmanship, but like I said, try Googling nonprofit board comments and see what you come up with. All right, one of the things that separates nonprofit organizations from for-profit organizations is the way that boards are established. If you were on the board of Bank of America, how did you end up there?
Worked at Bank of America.
You could have worked there. But who put you there? You got elected, right? By whom? Shareholders. So shareholders, vested people who have financial interest in the institution, theoretically put you in place as a director. Nonprofit organizations are self-perpetuating. That means that when you serve on a board, you get to have a role in picking the people who will steward the institution after you leave. So it's a very important responsibility that nonprofit boards have to recruit and orient new board members. And that means that we have to make sure we understand how board members are selected. The staff should certainly have some input into that, but should the executive director handpick all the board members? No. It's important for them to have a good working relationship, but most of us don't get to handpick our bosses, do we? This is the body that makes a decision about their benefits and salary. So the board's involvement or the executive director's involvement in board selection has to be very closely monitored. And then again, we've talked a lot about the need for proper orientation, those types of things. How is it that we make sure that we're well oriented? Number 8, as members of the next generation, young professionals in the room, this is an area where I would argue you have the most opportunity as a generation to help the institutions that you may serve and join. And that is enhancing the organization's public standing. The reality is that as board members, you become little foot soldiers or ambassadors for the institution. And for some people, that may be standing up in front of a civic group or a church group or some other community group and talking about the institution. It may be one-on-one working with potential donors. It may be as simple as you talking about it with your family and friends over golf or at dinner or what have you. But your ability to articulate what the organization does, to understand the services that it provides, and to share those with other people is critically important to your role as a board member. So the test for that is so you're on the board of XYZ organization and you're standing in the line at the grocery store and somebody taps you on the shoulder and notices that you're wearing a lapel pin that says Boys and Girls Club, right? And they say, I've heard about Boys and Girls Club, but tell me what they do. as a board member, in 30 seconds or less, you should be able to articulate what the organization does so that that person can then go home and share it with other people. So the test for you is, can you do that? If somebody said to you, what does this organization that you support or that you're involved in does, can you effectively share their mission and their services with somebody else? And I say that this is a particularly important role for young leaders in our community because of the advent of social media. In nonprofit organizations, some of them are doing an outstanding job of taking advantage of the various social media outlets to share their message. And others are so far behind the 8 ball, it's really frightening. And again, as a generation, that's something that I get to say I'm one of you for another year, so that we have embraced. And so I think that that's a talent or a skill, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that you can bring to an institution. Of all the responsibilities we'll talk about, this is the one that goes the most overlooked, and that's your responsibility to make sure that the institution is actually doing something. Most of us get involved with organizations because they have a good reputation, or because we have a friend or family member that's involved, and we trust their judgment. But the reality is that just because, I use Boys and Girls Club as an example, if a Boys and Girls Club comes to you and says, we served 300 children last year, that may sound impressive, but the next question that you as a board member should ask yourself is, so what? What did we do for those 300 children? It's not enough to say that a domestic violence shelter engaged with 500 women last year. What did we do for those 500 women? It's not enough for the Red Cross or for the Cancer Association to say, we passed out 1,500 flyers on home safety. It's not enough for us, the Humane Society, to say that they took in X number of animals. We have to be able, as board members, to answer the question, so what? And this speaks to that, determining, monitoring, and strengthening the organization's programs and services. So do the services we provide fit the mission? And can we effectively answer the question, so what? When somebody says, what does the organization do? And then lastly, it's important for us to understand that we are here to support the chief executive and assess his or her performance. Right? So who here is a perfect person? Who here is good at everything they do? There's not one dude that raises his hand. Nonprofit executives aren't perfect. They come to the table with baggage and with strengths in some areas and weaknesses in others. And so good board members, good boards of directors as a corporate body are going to understand what the strengths and the weaknesses of their CEO is. Because it's your responsibility as a board member to shore up the CEO in areas where they're weak, or to decide that they can't develop that skill, or it's not our responsibility as board members to be near completing financial statements and to find somebody that is qualified to do it. So making sure that the CEO is there and they're competent is critically important, but then monitoring them and supporting them throughout the process as well. So those are the 10 basic responsibilities of a nonprofit board. How many of you feverishly wrote those down? Yeah, like 20 of you actually were doing it, and I should have said this. I actually printed them out for you. Sorry about that. Anyway, I gotta have some fun when doing all this, right? So here are 4 or 5 things that are not part of those 10 basic responsibilities, but I think it's important for you to know. Here's the first one. It is expected of you to attend the board meeting. This is printed out. This is not printed out. If you want to write something down, right? All right. So you got to show up, and attendance itself, 75% should be like the bare minimum. Don't be like, well, the board meets 4 times a year. If I make it to 3, then I fulfilled my responsibility. You should attempt to make it to all of them. It should be a high priority for you to make it to all of them. If it isn't, then you got to assess whether or not you really have the time and the passion and the commitment to get to the institution. But attendance is important. And not just attendance at the board meetings, but attendance at special events, an annual meeting, at volunteer recognition opportunities. I told this story in the first group. Some years ago when I was at the United Way, I was invited to an organization that relies heavily on volunteers. They were having their annual volunteer appreciation event. And there must have been 600 people there, all folks that had given unselfishly their time to the institution. And they had a band, and they had beer and barbecue, and it was a great event, right? But I couldn't stay for the entire thing, so I met with the executive director and shook a few hands, and I asked the guy, I said, well, I'd love to speak to at least one of your board members so that I can tell them how good a job I think you do. And he said, oh, they don't come to this kind of thing. And I said, so there's not any board members here? And he goes, no, they typically just come to the board meetings. Was that acceptable? No. The volunteers are a critically important resource to the organization. And what message does it send that none of the 20 board members showed up to thank them? Right? So events are not just limited to the board meetings themselves, but other ways to show you support the institution. Here's one that people don't like saying, but I don't mind it. If you're on the board of an agency, you should make an annual personal financial contribution to the organization, period. More and more foundations like mine are asking the question of applicants, how many of your board members gave last year? And what was the average gift? Why do we ask that question? Because we're assessing how supportive the board actually is. And there's a mentality, I'm not going to argue with you here, that our time is our gift to the organization. And I agree. Critically important, you are desperately needed. But if you're going to support the institution, if you're going to go out and help generate revenue on its behalf, it's important for you also to have financial skin in the game. And for some people, that may be $10,000 a year. And for some of us, it might be $10 a year. But something that is meaningful to you that shows and demonstrates that you're supportive of the organization and its work. And then lastly, material participation, making sure that you're not just one of those folks that shows up and listens and says aye when they call for the vote. How many of you actually have served on boards before? I should have asked this question before. So roughly a fourth vote, right? So you're in board meetings and people get excited when they vote, so they follow Robert's Rules of Order and, they call for the motion and a second, and then they say everybody that's in favor say aye, and they say all opposed, like sign, or all opposed, say nay. Are any of you ever just really praying somebody's going to say nay? Have you ever really heard it? Been doing this 16 years. It happened one time, and y'all about peed myself when it did. It was an agency that I was serving as the CEO at the time, and they said it was a contentious issue. It was about providing a service that not everybody on the board thought was a good use of resources. And the president of the board looked at me and she said, we're just going to call a vote. And I said, okay, call the vote. So she called it. All those in favor, and people raised their hand and said aye. And then she said all those opposed, and people raised their hand and said nay. And I looked at her and I'm like, I don't know what to do now. My point is, be a board that occasionally has a naysayer in the room. Be the person that materially participates in assessment of whether or not it's a good path. Argue a little bit. Don't be the jerk that argues about everything. Anybody know somebody like that in their life? I'm related to a couple of them. Materially participate in the institution. And here's a couple of mistakes that I think good first-time board members make. The first one is not making sure they've been effectively oriented. There's a study that Notre Dame did some years ago, I think it was 2010, 2011, but Notre Dame instantly has the preeminent nonprofit leadership program in the country. It's a master's in nonprofit administration. It's probably the best program of its kind in the world. They did some research 5 or 6 years ago that looked at nonprofit boards and trends. A lot of it was self-reported data from individuals who had served, but some of it was longitudinal over a number of years where they followed corporate bodies of nonprofit boards. One of the things that they found was that in a board where any orientation of any kind took place, that people who participated in that orientation participated on average after about 6/10 of a meeting, meaning that they participated at some level in the very first meeting they attended, right? Boards where no orientation took place, people did not participate until the 3rd or the 4th meeting, right? So most boards are set up to meet quarterly or 6 times a year. Most boards have 3-year terms. Sometimes you can serve 2 3-year terms. So if you don't get oriented and it's a 3-year commitment, you've wasted almost an entire year of your service to the organization. So as young professionals, as people who may be first time serving on a board, it's important for you to be oriented, and if you don't get one, demand it in a nice way. You don't want to be that guy. Okay? Individuals serving on too many boards at one time. I get asked the question all the time, how many boards can a person serve on? It depends on you, your employer, your family, and the amount of time that you have to commit. But I would argue that if you're serving on more than 2 boards and you have a full-time job, you got to question how allegiant you are and whether or not you're able to be loyal and obedient to the organization's responsibilities if you're spreading yourself that thin. So for me, outside of my daily work, 2 is as much as I can handle. And I put this up here, I should have started with it. It is a unintended but wonderful outcome of board service that your resume looks more important and impressive. But that should not be the sole purpose that you choose to serve on the board of an organization. I'm not saying that we don't all get something out of it. God knows I've done it over the years. I have served in times where I thought, God, I don't want to do this, but if I ever apply for a job, I want to look good. In general, that should not be the primary motivation that drives us to serve. Third, common mistakes that we see is not questioning the executive staff, so just rubber stamping everything that comes through. And the flip side of that is micromanaging the executive staff and questioning every single thing that comes across the table. The board has to find that happy balance between micromanagement and being too laissez-faire. We talked earlier about not monitoring program quality, and I won't go into a lot of detail because we only have like a minute and a half left, but understanding that there are certain decisions that need board level attention, right? Like closing an office or adding an additional region to your service, or maybe even something like awarding the audit contract to a new firm. What doesn't need to make its way to the board is what color napkins to use at the annual event this year. And some of you are laughing because you've served on boards where you have that conversation in the room. One of the things that's on the sheet of paper that I'm going to provide you, so one side is the 10 basic board responsibilities. The flip side is this self-assessment readiness quiz that is provided by BoardSource, which is the National Association of Nonprofit Boards. And it's just a quick 10-question yes or no gut check. Are you really in a position to start serving on a board? Are you ready to serve an organization in that capacity? And then the last thing I want to leave you with is how important, we've talked a couple of times over the last 45 minutes about what motivates you to serve on the board and how important it is that you find something that you're passionate about. So when you leave and you start thinking about where, if you're thinking to yourself, this is something I want to do, this is a part of what I think my servanthood to the community is going to look like, don't just go out and find the first board that you can serve on, or go to the board that all the cool people serve on, or go to the board who your parents were involved with, or something like that. First, you have to ask yourself, do you have something to offer? And if you do, are you willing to offer it? So if you are an accountant, I know we've got a couple of those in the room, are you willing and able to offer your services to a finance committee? If you have skills in communication, are you willing to help the marketing staff, which is probably not terribly sophisticated at the organization, with their marketing strategies? If you have a human resources background, are you there to, are you willing to support the CEO if they get into a sticky situation, so on and so forth? Are you willing and able to provide access to your skills, connection, and resources to serve? Secondly, what issue or cause or population elicits strong emotion in you? Happiness, sadness, anger, or joy? Those are the causes that you're going to be more effective in serving than perhaps ones that are not as core to who you are. And so maybe, it could be women's rights or children, it could be animals, it could be the environment, it could be abortion, it could be any number of issues. But whatever it is that you're serving on, it doesn't, on one side or the other, get you a little bit emotional, then the likelihood that you're going to be an effective servant to that institution is pretty slim. How dirty do I want to get? And that's big. What he meant to be like. How dirty do you want to get? What I mean by that is how deep into the mud and the muck with the operation institution do you want to be? Because if you're one of those folks that really likes grassroots work and really wants to get in there and make things happen and to be what's commonly known as a working board, then you might want to be involved in an agency as a founder or as an early supporter or in the formative stages of the organization. If that's not your strength, if you're much more interested in governance and oversight and financial support and some of those higher level 10 things we talked about, then you might want to look at a more established board that's going to require more of your intellectual capital than it is your sweat equity. Right? So how dirty do I want to get my hands? Speaks to where in the organization's development it may be. And then lastly, and this gets to that survey or the questionnaire that BoardSource has provided us over there, am I willing, ready, and able to give my time, talent, and treasure? So, I'm skipping this, but I want you to see the Martin Luther King quote, because when you do presentations like this, you're obligated to have one inspiring quote somewhere in the presentation. So I can check this one off the list. And speaking of checking things off the list, this is where y'all clap because I did such a fabulous job, so clap real quick. We have about 2.5 seconds left. Is there any question out there that some of you may have? I'm sorry, these are resources that I highly recommend. Blue Avocado is a weird name, but it's a fantastic free website for nonprofit staff and for board members. It's got resources, board composition, matrices, and all kinds of things that are very valuable to check out. Any questions? Well, I'm happy to stand up here at the end and answer any questions you may have one-on-one. And as I said, I hope I've got enough for everybody in here, but there's a stack of the board readiness assessment quiz and the 10 basic responsibilities summary on your way out. Guys, thank you for being a part of the event today, and I hope all of you will go back to your communities. So.